highlighted what are the obstacles surrounding paradise. He mentioned centuries ago. He said the obstacles are أولا, firstly, al-ijtihad fi al-ibadat, to strive in the daily ritual practices that we have to make. Of praying 5 times a day, fasting, performance of Hajj, giving of charity. One has to strive in ibadah, in the rights and the regulations is the first obstacle. And we all know how difficult the prayer becomes early in the morning, late at night, the fasting of the month of Ramadan, etc. It's going to be difficult. Second, we find he mentions is to al-afu, to pardon people. That's also difficult. Many of us Muslims, we don't pardon individuals. That's the path to paradise. Likewise, you find qadmul ghayb literally carries the meaning of swallowing one's anger. How many Muslims, when they get angry, they can't control themselves? So a person who controls their anger is going on a path towards paradise. The fourth element he mentions, which concerns us tonight, remember he mentioned centuries ago, as-sabru an shahwat, to have patience to stay away from temptations and desires. That is a path towards paradise. This has been mentioned centuries ago. Centuries ago, that to control yourself, to abstain from temptations or falling into temptations, desires, is a path that will lead you to paradise. And then the opposite of all of the temptations, which becomes naturally the opposite. Every single path of temptation is a path that leads you towards the hellfire. So this is the first quest, or the first thing that we are trying to search for, is controlling what is known as our desires. The ghariza, the shahwa, the passion, the desires that all of us we have. And so how does a person minimize their urge or their passions for the youth that we find? If we go back to prophetic teachings, we find wonderful examples, if we contemplate and implement them, of how we can bring down that high level of temptation or desires. Actions such as swimming. Swimming is an exercise that works all parts of the body. Wrestling, archery, horse riding, racing. In other words, any type of physical combat or sport will alleviate and lessen the desires, the passion a young individual has. But we can see the average Muslim, unfortunately, they have no real vision of keeping themselves physically fit, spiritually fit, mentally fit. That's the average young Muslim that we find, has no real intention or focus towards their life. Likewise, to fast. The Prophet Muhammad advised that, O young individuals, marry. If you cannot marry, then upon you is to fast, as indeed it lessens the desires and it guards one's private parts or one's chastity. Fasting is another action. And any physical activity or hard days, labor, etc., you find all takes away the ghariza, takes away the temptation within the individual and lessens it within the soul of the individual. And the soul has been inclined at times to come towards these temptations. The Quran mentions, إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ إِلَّا مَا رَحِمَ رَبِّي. Indeed, the nafs, the soul, it calls towards evil, calls towards these inclinations, except for that soul which has the mercy and the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nearly upon it. So this is mentioned in Surah Yusuf. And if we go back to an earlier stage, the beginning of the Surah Yusuf, the 12th chapter of the Quran, whereby even you read the life of Yusuf alayhi salam, he was a young individual. One half of beauty was given to Yusuf alayhi salam. And thus you find that the first initial story about Joseph, about Yusuf alayhi salam, was when his brothers decided to put him or throw him into the well. They mentioned some strange words which concern us even today. They said, we're going to place him inside the well, and then after that they mentioned وَتَكُونُ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ قَوْمًا صَالِحِينَ. We'll do this evil action, then afterwards we'll become righteous, good individuals. The relationship between that and today is quite visible. Many young Muslims say, you know, later in my life, I'll become a pious individual. When I perform Hajj, when I come to the age of 40, so I'll do whatever haram I want to do, and then I'll come back and be a pious individual. Who knows that you're going to ever come back to become a pious individual? And thus we find that the main focus for the individual is towards their young days. And thus we find certain ahadith which mention that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala startles at the one who has no direction or feeling towards temptations. Meaning a person, a young individual, is controlling themselves to not fall into the snares and the traps or the temptations around them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala marvels at that individual, and this is very, very rare. To find a young individual is not falling into the worldly desires and traps that we find around us. Obviously, the task is immense, thus the reward is immense. So we're not rejecting the fact that it's not difficult. It is difficult to control oneself once one is young. But then look at the reward which is given in return for the person who controls themselves whilst they're in the prime of their life. 7 categories, 7 types of individuals will be under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when there will be no shade. Amongst those 7, if you read through them, you find directly number 2, the second category, the second individual, is shabun nasha'a fi ibadatillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is a young person, a young man or a young woman who have grown up serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not an elderly individual, a young person who spent their life serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when there will be no shade. Likewise, the hadith continues to mention number 5, if I'm not mistaken, that a young man is enticed by a beautiful woman. Likewise, it could be the opposite. And a person turns around and says, Inni akhafullah. I fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the task is immense and the reward is immense for that individual. And thus you find that the ulama, they mention that what is the key factor of these 7 categories or these 7 types of individuals. The rest of this stage don't concern us. But I said the key factor is each one of them breaks their temptations, breaks their desires, overrides them to become that privileged individual. The Imam Adil, the just Imam, the Imam is in power, in authority. He can oppress whomever he wants. He could take out whoever's right he wants and claim it as his own because he's in authority. But he overrides that passionate desire to enforce his own force and his own authority, and believes that he should be implementing the force of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So likewise, this young individual is at the prime of his or her life, whereby they can quite quickly and swiftly go into the temptation and desires, but they override that and go to a higher level of preserving themselves. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserves that individual and thus gives them this immense reward of being under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, we find that the person who is vigilant, based upon the hadith, that the foot of the son of Adam will not move until he is asked about 5. عن عمره فيما أفناه, about one's age, how one spent one's age. And then once again, what concerns us, وعن شبابه فيما أبلاه, and about your youthful days, how you conducted them or how you wasted them or how you took care of them. That is a prime time